He thought she was just a waitress, but in less than 60 seconds, she would become the only reason he didn't lose everything. The pen in Victor Castellano's hand hovered just above the final page of a $200 million contract, the polished mahogany table reflecting the soft golden light of the private dining room. Crystal glasses untouched, tension thick beneath the surface of polite conversation. Around him, men in tailored suits spoke quietly in Arabic, their voices smooth, confident, controlled, like they owned the outcome before the deal was even signed. Victor didn't understand the language, but he understood power, and everything about this room felt balanced, until it didn't. Amina Brooks moved silently between tables, her black uniform crisp, her posture straight. Her presence ignored the way staff always were in rooms like this, where money spoke louder than people. She kept her eyes down, her steps measured, her mind focused on staying invisible, because invisibility meant safety. But then she heard it. One word. Just one. Slightly off. Almost perfect, but not quite. Her fingers tightened around the tray she was holding, the faint clink of glass against glass barely audible, but inside her, something shifted. Her father's voice, calm and precise, echoed from years ago, teaching her at their small kitchen table how a single mistranslation could twist truth into a lie, how deals weren't broken with force, but with language. She froze for half a second, just enough for doubt to creep in. This wasn't her world. These weren't her people. And speaking up here didn't mean getting corrected. It meant consequences she couldn't predict. Her heart began to pound, steady and loud, as she listened again, this time more carefully, isolating the phrase, the structure, the intent behind the words. It wasn't just a mistake. It was deliberate. The contract wasn't what it claimed to be. It was something else entirely. Around the table, one of the men leaned forward, smiling, gesturing toward the document as if urging Victor to finish it, to close the deal, to seal something far bigger than ink on paper. Victor's expression remained unreadable, his sharp eyes scanning the page one last time, unaware that the language spoken beside him didn't match the promise written in front of him. Amina felt her breath catch. If she stayed silent, the moment would pass, the pen would touch paper, and everything would unfold exactly as planned, but not in Victor's favor. If she spoke, she would step out of the safety of invisibility and into a world where she did not belong. The room felt smaller now, the air heavier, every sound amplified, the low hum of conversation, the faint buzz of city lights outside, the quiet authority in Victor's presence. Her hands trembled slightly, but her eyes sharpened, because she knew something no one else in that room expected her to know. And in that moment, the most invisible person in the room became the only one who could see the truth. The silence stretched just a second too long, the kind that made people uncomfortable without knowing why, and Amina felt it settle over the room like a warning no one else could hear. She forced herself to move again, one step forward, then another, placing a glass carefully on the edge of the table as if nothing had changed, as if her heartbeat was not echoing in her ears. But her mind would not let it go. The phrase repeated itself, over and over, each time clearer, sharper, more dangerous. It was not just incorrect grammar. It was intent hidden inside precision, a shift in meaning so subtle it would slip past anyone who was not listening for it. One of the men across the table leaned back in his chair, smiling with easy confidence, his fingers tapping lightly against the contract. He spoke again in Arabic, slower this time, as if emphasizing reassurance, but to Amina, it sounded like confirmation. Her throat tightened. She glanced at Victor, just for a moment, and saw that same calm, controlled focus he carried like armor, the kind that came from years of making decisions others could not even comprehend. He trusted the numbers. He trusted the structure. He trusted that everyone in the room understood the same agreement. But they did not. Amina swallowed, her fingers curling slightly against her palm. She had learned long ago that knowledge did not protect you unless you were willing to use it, and using it always came with a cost. The last time her father had spoken up, he had not come home the same way again. The memory flickered through her mind, not as fear, but as a quiet, steady reminder of what silence could allow. Another voice cut through her thoughts, this time in English, smooth and practiced. Someone asked if everything was clear, if they could proceed, if they could finalize. The word finalize lingered in the air like a door about to close. Victor gave a small nod, lifting the pen slightly higher, his decision already made in his mind. Amina felt something shift inside her chest, not panic, not hesitation, but a sharp clarity that left no room for doubt. This was the moment. Not later. Not after. Now. Her breath steadied, her posture straightened, and for the first time since she had entered the room, she did not lower her gaze. She listened one more time, catching the exact phrase, the exact structure, the exact lie hidden beneath polished words. It was enough. Around her, the room remained composed, unaware, balanced on the edge of a decision that would ripple far beyond these walls. The city lights outside shimmered through the glass, distant and indifferent, while inside, everything narrowed to a single choice. Amina took a step closer to the table, her presence finally brushing against the awareness of those seated there, subtle but undeniable. One of the men frowned slightly, as if noticing her for the first time, but he said nothing. Victor's pen hovered, the final second stretching thin. And in that breath between action and consequence, Amina realized that being invisible had never meant being powerless. It had only meant waiting until the moment mattered enough to be seen. The moment did not announce itself with noise, but with a shift so subtle that only one person in the room recognized it. And Amina knew that once she crossed that line, there would be no returning to silence. Victor's pen lowered a fraction closer to the paper, the tip almost touching the signature line, while the men around him exchanged small, confident glances, their composure intact, their expectations already sealed. One of them leaned forward slightly, his voice calm, encouraging, as he spoke again in Arabic, repeating the same structure, the same polished phrasing, but to Amina it sounded different now, sharper, like a blade hidden inside velvet. Her pulse steadied, not from comfort, but from certainty. She understood every word. Not just the translation, but the intention behind it, the way the clause shifted responsibility, the way it quietly transferred control, the way it would bind Victor to terms he had never agreed to. It was not a mistake. It was design. Her father had once told her that the most dangerous lies were the ones that looked like truth when written down. And as she looked at the contract from where she stood, she could almost see it. The invisible line where meaning had been altered just enough to pass unnoticed. A soft laugh broke from one of the guests, directed not at the deal, but at her, a passing comment about timing, about service, about how staff should know when to step back. The words were light, almost dismissive, but they carried the weight of expectation, a reminder of her place in the room. Amina felt the heat rise in her chest, not anger, but the pressure of a decision that could not be delayed any longer. She had spent years learning when to stay quiet, when to disappear, when to let moments pass without leaving a trace. But this was not one of those moments. Her grip tightened briefly against the edge of the tray before she set it down with deliberate care on a nearby surface, the soft sound barely noticeable, yet final. The movement drew a glance, then another. Small, curious, uncertain. Victor's pen paused, not fully stopped, but no longer moving forward. Something in the room had shifted, even if no one had named it yet. Amina took one more step closer, her presence no longer blending into the background, her shoulders squared, her gaze steady for the first time. She could feel the eyes on her now, measuring, questioning, waiting for her to correct herself, to apologize, to retreat. But she did not. Instead, she drew a breath that felt heavier than it should, and in that single moment, the invisible boundary between observer and participant disappeared. Her voice, when it came, was not loud, but it carried with it a clarity that cut through the room more effectively than any raised tone could have. That clause does not say what you think it says. The words landed softly, but the effect was immediate. The man who had been smiling stopped. Another shifted in his seat. The quiet conversation faded into stillness. Victor did not look at the contract this time. He looked at her, directly, fully, as if seeing her for the first time not as staff, but as something else entirely. The space between them held for a second, then another, the weight of the moment pressing down on every person at the table. No one interrupted. No one dismissed her, because something in her tone had already changed the rules. And in that silence, the balance of power began to move, slowly, almost imperceptibly, away from certainty and toward the truth she was about to reveal. No one spoke for a full second, and in a room built on control, that silence felt louder than any argument. Victor's gaze did not leave Amina's face, his expression unreadable, but the pen in his hand no longer moved, hovering just above the paper as if the weight of her words had reached him before the meaning fully did. Across the table, one of the men let out a short, dismissive breath, leaning back in his chair with a faint smile that did not quite reach his eyes. He said something in Arabic again, slower this time, his tone calm, almost reassuring, as if smoothing over a misunderstanding that should not have existed. Amina heard every word clearly, and this time she did not hesitate. "He is not correcting anything," she said, her voice steady, her eyes shifting briefly toward Victor before returning to the speaker. "He is repeating the same clause, hoping you will sign before you understand it." The room tightened. Another man straightened in his seat, his fingers pressing lightly against the edge of the table, his composure slipping just enough to be noticed. Victor finally glanced down at the contract again, his eyes scanning the page, but now there was something different in his focus, a pause where there had been certainty before. "Translate it," he said quietly, his voice low but carrying across the room with absolute authority. Amina stepped closer, close enough now to see the exact line, the exact phrasing that had triggered everything. Her hand did not shake as she pointed to the clause, her voice calm, precise, the way she had learned years ago. "It appears to say that both parties share equal control over the assets," she began, her words measured, giving no space for confusion. "But the structure is uneven." In Arabic, the phrasing shifts responsibility in the second half of the sentence. It gives the other party final authority in any dispute, regardless of what is written in English. The explanation settled over the table like a slow realization. One of the men opened his mouth as if to interrupt, then stopped, his eyes flicking toward the others, searching for alignment that was no longer there. Victor's fingers tightened slightly around the pen before he set it down completely, the soft click against the table echoing more than it should have. He leaned back, just a fraction, his attention no longer on the document, but fully on Amina. "Say it again," he said. Amina did, this time translating the Arabic phrase word for word, her voice unwavering, each detail laid out with quiet precision. As she spoke, the confidence on the other side of the table began to fracture. Small glances exchanged, shoulders shifting, the balance of the room tilting in a way that could not be hidden anymore. And then, in the middle of her explanation, something else caught her attention. Not the words this time, but the reaction. One man did not look surprised. He did not look confused. He looked down too quickly, his hand adjusting his cuff as if he had expected this moment, as if he had been waiting to see whether it would happen. Amina's voice slowed for just a fraction of a second, the smallest hesitation, but enough for her to notice the pattern. Her eyes flicked toward him again, sharper now, reading not language, but behavior. And in that instant, she understood something far more dangerous than the contract itself. This was not just a trap written on paper. It had been allowed to reach this table. And someone here already knew exactly what it meant. The realization did not arrive all at once, but in fragments that aligned too perfectly to ignore, and Amina felt the weight of it settle in her chest as she continued speaking, her voice steady even as her thoughts sharpened beneath the surface. Victor had not moved, his posture still composed, but the shift in his attention was unmistakable now, focused not just on the contract, but on every reaction around the table. The men who had entered the room with confidence were no longer as still as they had been moments ago. One adjusted his tie, another reached for his glass, but did not drink. Small movements, barely noticeable, yet in a room built on control, they stood out. Amina finished her explanation of the clause, letting the final words rest without embellishment, without emotion, just the truth laid out plainly in a way that could not be dismissed. For a brief moment, no one responded. Then the man who had been leading the discussion leaned forward again, his smile returning, though thinner now, less certain. He spoke in English this time, his tone smooth, almost amused. "It seems there has been a misunderstanding," he said, glancing toward Victor but not quite holding eye contact. "Translation issues happen. That is why we provide official documentation in both languages." Amina did not step back. She did not look down. Instead, She spoke before Victor could respond, her voice calm, but firmer now. If it were a mistake, the correction would be immediate, she said. But he repeated the same structure twice. That is not confusion. That is intent. The words landed differently this time. There was no dismissal in the room now, only calculation. Victor's gaze shifted slowly from Amina to the man across from him, studying him in silence, measuring something deeper than the surface conversation. Then, almost imperceptibly, Victor turned his head slightly, not toward the speakers, but toward his own side of the table. Amina followed the movement instinctively, her eyes landing once more on the man she had noticed earlier, the one who had looked away too quickly. He was composed, but not neutral. His posture was controlled, but not relaxed. And now, under Victor's attention, there was the smallest delay before he met his gaze. It was enough. The room seemed to narrow around that single exchange, the unspoken tension stretching between awareness and confirmation. Amina felt it clearly now. This was never just about the contract. It was about access, about how something like this had made it into the room in the first place. She drew a breath, slower this time, choosing her next words with precision. "There is something else," she said, her voice quieter, but somehow more weight carried in it. The shift was immediate. Every eye returned to her. Victor did not interrupt. He did not question. He simply watched. Amina's gaze remained steady, moving only once more toward the man whose reaction had not matched the others. "Everyone here is reacting to what I said," she continued. "Except him." The statement was simple, but it cut through the room with unmistakable clarity. The man she indicated straightened slightly, his expression controlled, but now unmistakably aware that he had been seen. Victor's eyes followed Amina's line of sight, settling on the same man, his silence deepening, not with uncertainty, but with understanding forming piece by piece. No accusations were spoken. No raised voices broke the tension. But the shift was complete. The balance of the room had changed. And for the first time since the meeting began, the deal was no longer the center of attention. The truth was, the air in the room changed in a way that no one could ignore, not because anyone raised their voice, but because attention had shifted completely, and Victor Castellano was no longer looking at the contract, nor at the men who had come prepared to close the deal, but at the one person who had not expected to be seen. The man Amina had pointed out held his posture, composed, measured, but there was a delay in his response that did not belong in a room where every movement was usually precise. Victor leaned back slightly in his chair, his fingers resting loosely against the table now, no longer holding the pen, no longer participating in the rhythm that had been guiding the meeting just moments before. "Look at me," Victor said quietly, his voice calm, controlled, carrying no anger, but something far more unsettling, clarity. The man hesitated for a fraction of a second before meeting his gaze, and that fraction was enough. Around the table, the others remained still, their earlier confidence replaced by a cautious silence, as if they understood that whatever was happening now was no longer part of the negotiation they had prepared for. Amina did not move, but she felt the weight of the moment settle deeper, the realization that this had gone beyond language, beyond translation, into something structural, something intentional. Victor's eyes remained fixed on the man, studying him not with suspicion, but with recognition forming in real time. "You reviewed this before it came to me," Victor continued, not as a question, but as a statement. The man nodded slowly, his voice controlled. "I did. Everything was checked." The answer sounded correct, but it lacked something, a certainty that should have been there. Amina saw it immediately, the same way she had heard the flaw in the language, not in what was said, but in how it was delivered. Victor's gaze did not waver. "And you missed this," he said, his tone still even, but now edged with something sharper. The man's jaw tightened slightly, just enough to register. If there was a discrepancy, it was not intentional. The words were chosen carefully, but they created more space than they closed. Amina's breath slowed as she listened, recognizing the pattern again, deflection, not denial. Victor's fingers tapped once against the table, a small, deliberate motion, before he turned his head slightly toward Amina. "You are certain," he said. It was not a challenge. It was a request for precision. Amina met his gaze without hesitation. "Yes," she said. "The structure is consistent. It was written to pass as balanced, but it is not. and it was repeated verbally to reinforce the same meaning. Her voice remained calm, but there was no doubt left in it. Victor nodded once, slowly, as if aligning pieces that had already begun to form a clearer picture. Then he shifted his attention back to the man beside him. "You brought this in," Victor said, the words landing with quiet finality. The man opened his mouth slightly, as if to respond, but paused, recalibrating, searching for a path that no longer existed. Around them, the others remained silent, their roles in the room shrinking with each passing second. Amina felt the shift completely now. The deal had dissolved without being formally rejected. The authority in the room had not disappeared, but it had been redirected away from agreement and toward accountability. And in that moment, the most powerful man in the room was no longer deciding whether to sign a contract, but understanding who had expected him to. The silence that followed was no longer uncertain. It was deliberate, controlled, and entirely owned by Victor Castellano, who now sat back in his chair with a stillness that carried more authority than any command could have. The man beside him shifted slightly, not enough to draw attention in any other room. But here, in this moment, every movement was amplified, every hesitation exposed. Amina remained where she stood, her posture steady, her presence no longer something that could be ignored or dismissed, but she did not speak again, because she understood that the next move did not belong to her. Victor's gaze lingered on the man for a long second, then another, as if giving him the space to correct himself, to realign with the truth before it was spoken aloud. But the correction did not come. Instead, the man exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering just a fraction, a subtle shift that spoke louder than denial ever could. Around the table, the others watched carefully, no longer participants, but witnesses to a change in direction they had not anticipated. Victor reached forward, not for the pen, but for the contract itself, lifting the top page and letting it fall back into place with a soft, controlled motion. "You knew," he said, his voice calm, but final. It was not an accusation. It was recognition. The man did not respond immediately, and in that delay, the truth settled fully into the room. Amina felt it clearly, the way a moment transforms when something hidden becomes visible, when what was once uncertain becomes undeniable. The man's eyes flickered briefly toward the others at the table, searching for support that was no longer there, before returning to Victor. "I reviewed what was given to me," he said carefully, choosing each word with precision. "And you chose not to question it," Victor replied, his tone unchanged, but the weight behind it unmistakable. The exchange was quiet, almost restrained, but it carried a finality that needed no volume. Amina watched as Victor placed the contract back onto the table, not pushed away, not dismissed with force, but set down with intention, as if closing something that no longer required discussion. The men across from him remained still, their earlier composure replaced by a careful neutrality, as if waiting to see how far this would go. Victor's attention shifted briefly toward them, his expression composed, but now distant, no longer engaged in negotiation, but in conclusion. "This meeting is over," he said simply. No raised voice, no explanation, just a statement that carried absolute authority. Chairs did not scrape, voices did not rise, but the energy in the room changed immediately, the certainty that had filled it at the beginning now replaced by something quieter, more cautious. The men gathered their things with measured movements, their earlier confidence replaced by an awareness that the outcome they had expected was no longer possible. Amina remained still, her breath steady, her mind clear, but beneath it all, she could feel the shift that had taken place, not just in the room, but in how she was seen within it. Victor stood slowly, his height commanding, his presence filling the space without effort, and for a brief moment, his gaze returned to her. Not as a question, not as a test, but as acknowledgement. And in that look, there was something new, something that had not been there when the meeting began. Recognition. The room did not empty all at once, but in quiet, measured movements, as if everyone understood that something larger than the deal itself had just taken place, and no one wanted to be the first to acknowledge it out loud. Chairs shifted softly against the polished floor. Documents were gathered without urgency, and the men who had entered with certainty now carried themselves with a careful restraint, their earlier confidence replaced by something far more controlled. Amina remained where she stood, her hands now resting calmly at her sides, no longer holding a tray, no longer pretending to be part of the background, because that illusion had already been broken. She watched as the last of the guests made their way toward the exit, their voices low, their expressions unreadable, but she did not follow them with her eyes for long. Her attention returned to Victor, who had not moved from his place at the table. He stood in silence for a moment after the room cleared, his posture straight, his presence steady, as if he were allowing the weight of what had just happened to settle before taking the next step. Then, without rushing, he turned slightly, his gaze finding her again, direct and unguarded in a way that had not existed before. "What is your name?" he asked. The question was simple, but it carried none of the dismissal that had once defined her role in the room. Amina met his gaze, her voice steady. "Amina Brooks." Victor nodded once, as if committing it to memory, not out of courtesy, but with intention. There was a brief pause, not awkward, not uncertain, but deliberate, as if he were choosing his next words with the same precision he had used moments ago to dismantle the situation at the table. "You understood everything they said," he continued, not as a question, but as a recognition of fact. Amina did not hesitate. "Yes." Her answer was calm, without emphasis, because the truth did not need to be made larger than it already was. Victor studied her for a moment longer, his expression thoughtful now, not distant, not cold, but measured in a different way. "And you chose to speak," he said. There was something in that statement, something that acknowledged the risk without naming it directly. Amina felt it, the weight behind his words, the understanding that this had not been a small decision. She nodded once. It was necessary. The response hung between them, simple, but complete. Victor's gaze shifted briefly toward the table, toward the contract that now lay untouched, then back to her. "Most people would have stayed silent," he said. Amina did not look away. "Most people were not listening," she replied. The answer came without hesitation, not defiant, not sharp, just clear. For a brief second, something changed in Victor's expression, not fully a smile, but a recognition of something he respected. The silence returned, but it was different now, no longer heavy, no longer uncertain, but steady, grounded in understanding. Victor stepped away from the table, closing the distance between them by a single pace, enough to shift the dynamic once more, but not enough to intimidate. "You saw something no one else did," he said quietly. Amina held his gaze. "I heard something no one else understood." The distinction mattered, and he recognized it. Victor nodded slowly, the acknowledgement deeper this time. And in that moment, the space between them was no longer defined by status or expectation, but by something far more rare in a room like that. Respect. Victor did not look away immediately, and Amina understood that the moment was not over. It had simply shifted into something quieter, something that required a different kind of attention. The room, now nearly empty, felt larger than before, the absence of voices making every small sound more distinct, the faint hum of the city outside, the soft reflection of light against glass, the echo of decisions that had already changed the course of what was supposed to happen here. Victor turned slightly, his gaze moving toward the contract once more, but this time he did not reach for it. Instead, he studied it from a distance, as if seeing it for what it truly was rather than what it had been presented to be. "They expected this to work," he said quietly, not to anyone in particular, but the words carried enough weight that they did not need direction. Amina followed his line of sight, her mind still tracing the structure of the language, the intention behind each phrase, the careful construction that had nearly gone unnoticed. "It would have," she replied, her voice calm, not as a statement of doubt, but of fact. Victor glanced back at her, a subtle shift in his expression acknowledging the truth in her words. There was no defensiveness in him, no need to deny how close the outcome had been. Instead, there was something else, something more precise. Awareness. He took a slow step around the table, the distance between them closing slightly, not in confrontation, but in consideration. "You said someone here already knew," he continued. It was not a question, but it carried an expectation of clarity. Amina did not hesitate. "Yes." Her eyes moved briefly toward the place where the man had been sitting, now empty, but the imprint of his presence still clear in her memory. He did not react the same way as the others. He was not surprised. He was waiting to see if it would be noticed. Victor absorbed this without interruption, his posture still, his focus sharpened in a way that suggested he was already placing pieces together beyond what had been spoken aloud. "And you are certain," he said again, not because he doubted her, but because certainty was something he valued in moments like this. Amina met his gaze. "Yes." The simplicity of her answer carried more weight than a longer explanation ever could. For a brief second, the silence returned, but it was not empty. It was filled with understanding, with conclusions forming just beneath the surface. Victor exhaled slowly, not in frustration, but in acknowledgement of how close the situation had come to unfolding differently. Then, without shifting his tone, he spoke again. "You stopped the $200 million mistake," he said. The number was not emphasized, but it lingered in the air, not as a measure of money, but as a measure of consequence. Amina did not react to the figure. To her, it had never been about the amount. It had been about the truth hidden within the language. "I stopped a sentence from being misunderstood," she said quietly. The distinction was small, but it changed everything. Victor studied her for a moment longer, and this time, there was no distance in his gaze, no barrier of role or expectation. "And that sentence would have cost me everything," he replied. The words were not dramatic. They were precise. Amina held his gaze, steady, grounded, as if she understood exactly what he meant without needing further explanation. Outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of how close something significant had come to shifting inside this quiet room. And in that stillness, Victor Castellano recognized something he had not expected to find that night. Not just intelligence, not just awareness, but someone who understood the weight of truth and chose to speak it anyway. Victor remained still for a moment longer, as if allowing the truth to fully settle into the space between them, not rushed, not forced, but acknowledged in its entirety. Then he turned slightly, his gaze drifting toward the large window that overlooked the city, the lights stretching endlessly into the distance, each one representing a decision, a risk, a consequence. "Most people only see numbers," he said quietly, his voice measured, reflective. "They see profit, loss, leverage. They do not see what is hidden underneath." Amina followed his line of sight, her expression calm, her posture unchanged, but there was a quiet understanding in her eyes. "Language hides things," she replied, "especially when it is meant to." Victor nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had always known but had not needed to articulate until now. He turned back toward the table, reaching for the contract again, but this time his movements were deliberate, analytical, not with the intent to sign, but to dissect. He flipped through the pages, scanning each line with a different kind of attention, the kind that questioned instead of accepted. "If this was placed here," he said, his tone steady, "then it passed through multiple layers before reaching me." Amina did not interrupt. She knew the answer did not need to be spoken aloud. Victor closed the folder gently, placing it back on the table with quiet finality. "That means this was not a single failure," he continued. It was allowed. The word carried more weight than anything else he had said, because it shifted the focus from mistake to intention. Amina felt the shift clearly. This was no longer about what had almost happened. It was about how it had been set in motion. Victor took a step away from the table, his presence filling the space once more, but now there was something different in the way he carried it. Not just authority, but clarity sharpened by what he had just uncovered. "You said he was waiting," Victor said, his eyes returning to Amina. "Yes," she answered without hesitation. He was not listening for errors. He was listening to see if anyone else would. Victor absorbed this, his expression tightening just slightly, not with anger, but with precision, as if each piece of information was being placed exactly where it belonged. "That means he was confident," Victor said. "Confident that no one here would understand." Amina nodded once. "Because no one here was supposed to." The words settled heavily, not dramatic, not exaggerated, but exact. Victor exhaled slowly, his gaze drifting briefly toward the door where the others had exited, then back to her. "And yet you did," he said. Amina did not shift under the weight of that observation. "I was not supposed to be part of the conversation," she replied. "That is why I could hear it clearly." The distinction was subtle, but it carried a deeper truth, one that Victor recognized immediately. He studied her for a moment longer, not evaluating, not testing, but understanding. Being overlooked, he said quietly, has its advantages. Amina held his gaze. Only if you choose to use them. The response came without hesitation, without pride, just clarity. Victor nodded again, slower this time, the acknowledgement deeper, more deliberate. The room remained quiet, the contract untouched, the deal dissolved without a single raised voice. But something else had taken its place. Something far more significant. A shift not just in outcome, but in awareness. And in that moment, Victor Castellano understood that what had been prevented tonight was not just a financial loss, but something far more difficult to recover from. Trust. Victor did not move immediately after the words settled between them, and Amina could feel that something deeper than the contract was being evaluated now, something that did not exist on paper and could not be rewritten with better language. The room, now completely empty except for the two of them, seemed to hold its breath, as if even the quiet space understood that what came next would not be about the deal that had been stopped, but about what it revealed. Victor walked slowly along the edge of the table, his hand brushing lightly against the polished surface, not absent-mindedly, but with intention, as if grounding his thoughts in something solid. Trust is not something I question often, he said finally, his voice low, controlled, but carrying a weight that made the words feel heavier than their simplicity suggested. Because by the time I need to question it, it usually means I waited too long. Amina listened without interrupting, her posture unchanged, her presence steady, but inside, she understood the shift in the conversation. This was no longer about what she had heard. It was about what he had allowed. Victor stopped walking and turned toward her again, his gaze direct, but no longer distant. You saw something in seconds that should have been caught long before it reached this table, he continued. That is not just awareness. That is discipline. Amina held his gaze, not reacting to the compliment, because she did not see it as one. It is habit, she said quietly. When you grow up around language, you learn to listen for what does not belong. Victor studied her for a moment, as if weighing the difference between natural ability and something earned through experience. And where did you learn that habit? He asked. The question was simple, but it carried a deeper curiosity now, one that reached beyond the moment. Amina paused, just briefly, not out of hesitation, but because the answer was not something she offered lightly. My father, she said. He worked with contracts. Translations. He used to say that the most important part of a sentence is the part people assume is correct. The words lingered in the air, and Victor did not interrupt, sensing there was more beneath them. Amina's gaze shifted slightly, not away from him, but inward, as if tracing something she had not spoken about in a long time. He once found something like this, she continued. A clause that did not match what it claimed to be. He spoke up. The room remained still, the silence deepening, not empty, but attentive. Victor's expression did not change, but there was a sharper focus in his eyes now. And what happened? He asked. Amina met his gaze again, her voice calm, but carrying a quiet finality. After that, he stopped being invited into rooms like this. The statement was not dramatic. It did not need to be. The implications settled naturally, without force, without exaggeration. Victor absorbed it without comment, his posture still, his attention unwavering. So you understood the risk, he said. Amina nodded once. Yes. There was no hesitation in her answer. Victor took a slow breath, his gaze shifting briefly toward the empty chairs, the untouched glasses, the contract that had almost changed everything, then back to her. And you spoke anyway. Amina did not look away. Because silence would not have changed the outcome, she said. It would have only delayed it. The clarity of her response settled into the room, filling the space where uncertainty had once been. Victor held her gaze for a moment longer, and this time, there was no distance left in it. Only recognition, not just of what she had done, but of why she had done it. And in that moment, he understood that what had walked into this room as a waitress had revealed something far more valuable than the deal he had almost signed. Judgment. Victor did not respond immediately, and that silence felt intentional, not empty but deliberate, as if he was measuring the weight of everything she had just said against something far older than this room, far more complex than a single decision or a single mistake. The city lights beyond the glass continued to flicker in quiet indifference, but inside, The stillness had taken on a different shape, no longer tense, no longer uncertain, but resolved in a way that could not be undone. He walked slowly back toward the table, his steps controlled, his presence steady, and when he reached the contract again, he did not pick it up. Instead, he placed his hand flat against the cover, as if acknowledging it not as a document, but as a turning point. "You said your father stopped being invited into rooms like this," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a depth that suggested he was no longer speaking only about her past. Amina nodded once, her expression unchanged, her posture grounded. "Yes." Victor's fingers pressed lightly against the table before he lifted his hand away, turning back toward her with a quiet clarity that had not been there before. "That is not because he was wrong," he said. "It is because he was inconvenient." The word lingered, sharp in its simplicity, cutting through the space between them with a truth that required no explanation. Amina did not react outwardly, but something in her eyes shifted, not surprise, but recognition. She had known that long before this moment, but hearing it spoken so plainly carried a different weight. Victor continued, his tone unchanged. "People do not remove what threatens them with noise. They remove it with silence." The statement settled into the room, steady, precise, leaving no room for misunderstanding. Amina held his gaze, her voice quiet when she answered. "Then I understand why he taught me to listen." Victor nodded slowly, the acknowledgement deeper now, more personal. He stepped closer again, not in authority, not in distance, but in alignment, as if the space between them no longer needed to be maintained by role or expectation. "You were not supposed to be part of this," he said. Amina did not deny it. No, the simplicity of her response matched his own. Victor studied her for a moment longer, and this time, there was no evaluation in his gaze, only decision. "And yet you changed the outcome," he said. Amina's voice remained steady. "I revealed it." The distinction was small, but it mattered. Victor recognized that immediately. "No," he said quietly. "You did more than that." The words were not raised, not emphasized, but they carried a certainty that settled deeper than anything else he had said that night. Amina did not respond, not because she disagreed, but because she understood that the moment no longer required her to explain anything further. Victor turned slightly, his gaze moving once more across the room, taking in the empty chairs, the untouched glasses, the contract that now meant something entirely different than it had before. Then he looked back at her, and for the first time since the night began, his expression held something that was not just control or calculation. It held resolve. "From now on," he said, his voice even, but unmistakably final, "you will not stand outside conversations like this." The words did not sound like an offer. They sounded like a shift in reality. Amina did not react immediately, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, but beneath the surface, she understood exactly what he meant. Not a favor, not a reward, a change in position, a recognition that could not be reversed. And in that moment, the line that had once separated her from the room did not just blur. It disappeared. The words did not echo, but they did not need to. Because what Victor had just said did not belong to the moment alone, it extended beyond it, reshaping something that had been fixed long before either of them had entered the room. Amina stood still, not out of hesitation, but because she understood the weight of what had just been placed in front of her, not as an opportunity, but as a shift that would not allow her to return to where she had been before. The quiet in the room settled into something steady, something resolved, and for the first time since the night began, there was no tension left in it, only clarity. Victor did not look away, his gaze holding hers with the same precision he had applied to everything else that evening. But now there was something different in it, something that did not measure or test, but recognized. "You listened when no one else did," he said, his voice calm, but carrying a finality that made the statement feel permanent. Amina did not lower her eyes. "I was taught to listen for what others ignore," she replied, her tone even, grounded in something deeper than the moment itself. Victor nodded once, slowly, as if confirming a decision that had already been made. He turned slightly, his attention moving once more across the empty space, the table, the contract, the remnants of a meeting that had begun with certainty and ended with something entirely different. "Rooms like this," he said quietly, are built on the assumption that everyone inside understands the same reality. He paused for a fraction of a second, then added, "Tonight proved that assumption wrong." Amina remained silent, not because she disagreed, but because she understood that the statement was not meant to be answered. Victor stepped away from the table, closing the distance between them completely now, not in dominance, not in formality, but in alignment, as if the space that once separated their roles no longer applied. "You were not invited," he continued, "but you were the only one who understood what was happening." The words were simple, but they carried the full weight of the night's outcome. Amina met his gaze, her voice steady when she spoke. Understanding does not depend on invitation. The response came without hesitation, without defiance, just truth. Victor held her gaze for a moment longer, and then, almost imperceptibly, something shifted in his expression, not a smile, not a gesture, but a quiet acknowledgement that required no further explanation. He turned toward the door, taking a single step, then paused, his voice returning one last time, calm, controlled, but unmistakably clear. "Starting tomorrow," he said, "you will not be serving tables." The statement was not softened, not expanded, not explained, because it did not need to be. Amina did not respond immediately, her breath steady, her posture unchanged, but within that stillness, she understood exactly what had changed. Not just her position, but the way she would be seen, the way she would be expected to stand, to speak, to exist within spaces that had once been closed to her. Victor did not wait for acknowledgement. He did not ask for agreement. He simply stepped out of the room, leaving behind the quiet, the contract, and the undeniable shift that had taken place. Amina remained where she stood for a moment longer, her eyes moving briefly across the table, the empty chairs, the space that had once defined her